But at home, he would withdraw to the front room, the bedroom, and I remember throughout my childhood, he would be bent over like a Hasidic scholar, but over Yiddish poets. His great solace was Yiddish poetry, and he worshipped. His very favourite poet was Moshe Leib Alperin, who, of course, was the voice of the Lower East Side. And he loved his work. He's got a wonderful poem, an Alte Buch mit Lieder, right? And I think it's his best poem, and it's a poem about this book he's carried with him. I've donated most of his books to this library, but I've kept this book where he pressed flowers from Bialystok. You can still see them between the pages. He got it in 1919. My father, instead of packing clothes, packed books, and he brought over a suitcase full of Yiddish poets and Yiddish books. But this was his most precious possession and his major companion. As you can see, the pages are quite, you can see how worn they are. And every now and then there are still, pressed leaves, flowers. Some have been lost on the journey. Some are still there. And then, he rebounded many times. He did a bit of book binding back in Bialystok, so this is a hobby of his. So again and again he binded. And this is the collected works of Moshe Leib Alperin. And I think he worshipped him as a poet. And I think he identified with him partly because I think they had a similar nature, or I think he liked to imagine he had a similar nature. And also they were both immigrants. And I think, in a way, his poetry became even more relevant to him when he immigrated because, for obvious reasons, because that's part of what Alperin writes about. He used to perform them. Before the war, he used to declamer, right? And it's interesting that many years later, he never did that after the war. But many years later, we had a gathering for him and we put together his poems. And I'll come to that in a moment because there was a revival for him as a Yiddish poet. But he got up and he began reciting. There's a famous Alperin poem, the Gassenpoiker, right? The street drummer, I think it is. And he was another man. When he retired and started writing again, one of the very first poems he wrote was an Alte Buch mit Lieder, and that's the book, and this is the poem. Now it's interesting that when he was writing poetry in Bialystok, he'd signed it Meier Zabludowski. By the time he was writing in the late 70s, 1980s, he was Meier Zable. So he changed the name to Zable, and he liked the change. For him it had a certain ring, and so he didn't return to Zabludowski. Ein alter Buch mit Lieder. Nicht verwelkte Bäumerblätter, sondern die vergällte Blätter in dem Buch mit alten Toveln zwischen alle meine Bücher auf glanzigem Papier. Nicht teut, sondern die Oderen, die Wörter Keiterlach, die Versen Schürerlach, die schwarze Pinterlach. Sie öffnen zu mir die Eigerlach, wenn ich guck in sie sich tief rein. In dem Buch mit alten Toveln leben, zappeln sie die Lieder, kräftige und ewige erfüllen. Wenn das Herz, das einzige, die irdische von meinen beliebsten Dichter, so in Jahren verwandelt es in Staub. Ich hab das Buch noch abgehit in mein Geborgenland, geführt im Iberiamim und lang genutzt im Da. Und gewesen ist es ständig gut zu mir, in jeder feierlichen Schau. Und geältert sich zusammen, wie ein Zwilling von ein Mammen. Nicht verwelkte Blätter, nein, sondern sei die gelben Blätter, nein. In dem Buch von einem nicht glanzigen Papier, wie lang ich leb noch, wird ständig liegen oben an auf der Bücherpolster bei mir. So you can see he loved this book, and I think it's a lovely poem. I think it especially for me that line, und geältert sich zusammen wie ein Zwilling von ein Mann, is gorgeous and sums up the way he felt about it. And the poems he was writing are very, very interesting. There's one that's studied in the Year 12 Yiddish curriculums. It's called A Freundliche Hand, which we then put to music. It's with one of my books is called The Fig Tree, and we have a companion CD where we have, you know, Greek, Italian, Jewish, and Australian performers, you know, singing songs of the migrant experience, basically. And one of the Frady Morocco's, you know, Klezmania, that wonderful klezmer band, David Kreitzer, you know, put it to music, and it became part of their repertoire. And then A Freundliche Hand, it's about a guy who's walking through, very alienated, through the streets of probably Carlton, you know, and he just feels, you know, he's just a lost person in this strange land. And then all of a sudden he sees an old friend, you know, and he sticks out his hand, in A Freundliche Hand, from the old world. And he says, and in that moment, you know, the skies were no longer grey, you know, the place was, and suddenly it became home. This poem, A Freundliche Hand, was actually turned into music. It was set to music by David Kreitzer from Klezmania, and Frady Morocco sings it. She sang it here in this hall just a few weeks ago. A Freundliche Hand, von Melville Davis. Von zwischen fremde tausende Vorbeigeher hat wehgetan auf mir a Freude. So hat Hand erwarme sich ausgestreckt. Ein alter Freund, fragt mich, wie es geht. Von so viel Penne mehr gleichgültige, aufgescheint upon ihm lichtig unbekannt. Und Ort, a Hand erwarme, a Vogel gleich, es zappelt in dein Hand. Stott hat mehr nicht fremd, also mir ausgesehen, euch der Himmel mehr nicht, also greu. So hat mein Freund gebracht, die Schein von Jugendtag, und ein Himmel mild und bläu. Gefühlt sich da ein Land wie ein Verlorener, ein Mensch und Freund und Sprach und Mut, und mit einmal eine Hand ein freundlicher und heimlich wert in ein Minute. And this poem's actually now become a part of the Yiddish curriculum, and people write, you know, essays on it. I think in those 4 verses, you can write essays from those 4 verses. It just sums up so much about the immigrant experience. And that was published in Melbourne in 1976. And they were beautiful poems, very reflective, and like the Alter Buch mit Lieder. They were published in, you know, the few outlets we had back then still for Yiddish, the Melbourne Chronicle, that was published by the Kadima with a Yiddish section, and the Yiddish Anayas until it, you know, was finally caved in. And so, yeah, he was flying. In the final day, he wrote his final Yiddish poem. It was a work in progress. And more or less the first line said, the world will get on very well, thank you very much, without me being here. And then there's a little moment, a little line where he says, I feel like a little leaf about to fall into eternity, you know, into the Ewigkeit. And so, you know, there was something amazing about how it panned out for him. Right? It really was. And yeah, it was a great gift for me, because I'm getting into that territory now. So, you know, whenever I falter, I hear my father say, you know, for every step, make it worth 2. So, yeah, he got there in the end, somehow.
Were there particular times or places where he would write, as you remember?
Yeah, look, he wrote in that front room. He had a little, it was a makeshift table. it was the dressing table, right? And it would double up for him. He was very eccentric, So in his older age, he was very inventive. He had all these little contraptions. He never spent. They were living off the pension by that stage, but he had a board of masonite, which he whack out from under the bed and put it on. And so he transformed the dresser into a table, and he'd use that. He wouldn't buy something special for it. But I'm not that different. My office is in the boot of my car, right? I brought my bag in because it's got my computer. I write all over town.